Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Christian Reeve Podcast. Today's guest is a voiceover artist and a copywriter and many other different things, all the way from Portland, Oregon. His name is Andrew Scott. Welcome to the show. How you doing?
Hey, Christian. I am doing great, man. Thanks for having me on the show.
Now, I'm going to explain. Well, first of all, thank you very much for appearing on the show. It's a real pleasure to have you here. Secondly, I too am a voice actor and voiceover artist.
Okay. That would be why.
It's the big reveal. No. So you can tell why I'm so excited to have this gentleman on my show. There's a million different things I could ask you, but I think that the first thing that kind of struck me as soon as I heard your voice was, and you did kind of clarify it before, radio. You've definitely either been on radio before or there's some history there. Please talk us through your time on radio first before we get into anything else.
Yeah, there is some very old history there. For your listeners, my name is Andrew Scott, and as Christian said, I'm a producer and a voiceover artist and a narrator and a YouTuber and a voiceover coach and a voiceover educator on YouTube. And yeah, my path into this world started back in the 80s. I grew up wanting to be on radio. I grew up literally from about the age of 5 years old. I wanted to be an announcer for some reason. I would memorize the commercials of the day and be able to recite them at the drop of a hat at 5 and 6 years old. And my older brothers and sisters would be like, why on earth is that something that you do, you strange child? But, that really led me into most of the things that you get into when you're in your teens and your early 20s. I was a musician. I was a rock and roll roadie for a while. I was a club DJ, and I had always wanted to get into radio. But getting into radio in the market that I was in the Midwest was you needed to know people. And I, at that point in time, really didn't know people. But I knew enough people, and I did get work in both college radio, which is easy because you're there, but I parlayed that into some time in broadcasting, mostly working as a board operator, as a board op overnight, putting in the carts and playing the commercials and making sure that record wasn't skipping. Yes, we were still using LPs back then, but that's in vogue now, so I sound like I've got some credential on the street. But I did a little bit of time in that. I was more focused really on music production, home studio recording, which was becoming something of a thing, where you could record multi-track, and we would build studios in our parents' disused cobweb-filled basements and try to build isolation booths and pretty much annoy everybody until all hours of the night. But really, that practice combined with doing a little bit of work in radio really did set me on the path to doing voiceover production from home, learning recording techniques, learning routing, learning about things like microphones. And, later on, from when I was a roadie back in the 90s, and yeah, I probably worked for them. That's I was doing a lot of work in the grunge era of rock and roll. And so I did a lot of work for a lot of famous bands over the course of about 5 or 6 years. But really, oh, yes, those guys. No, I've done shows for Pearl Jam. I've done shows for Soundgarden. I've done shows for, I go back. So Screaming Trees, Mother Love Bone. I did a couple shows for Mother Love Bone when they were still, a going concern before the tragedy. Lots of other, I did time on the road. I did about 40% of my time on the road. The other 60% of my time was I was a local roadie. I was local crew. When a big show showed up and they needed more bodies aside from the ones that were packed into the smelly bus, then, they would hire a local crew. And I worked for a company, because I owned my own sound system. I worked for a company that would pull us in, and I would bring my guys, and we would complement the touring crew. But what that wound up putting me in touch with were recording professionals. And so I did some second engineer work at a couple famous studios in the Midwest, and was fortunate enough to work with some amazing people like Butch Vig, who of course very famously produced Nirvana and is the drummer for Garbage. And at some point, I just decided I'd better have a fallback. And so I went to college and I got a degree in philosophy, which makes me immensely employable. But I did a bunch of other things there, but that was really kind of my path in that set the tone for me as an audio professional. And the one thing that was keeping me away from doing commercial voiceover work was back when I was wanting to do it, we were still on tape. If you were lucky, you had a DAT machine, you had a DAT machine, which was digital tape recording. But those were prohibitively expensive for somebody like me. And what really changed was around about the millennium, we were being held back in home recording by a simple mechanical prohibition. Hard disks didn't spin fast enough for us to record high quality audio back then. We were like 38, 4,200 RPM disks, and that couldn't keep up with an audio signal. As soon as we crossed over that threshold and we got into 58, 7,200 RPM disks, that's what broke the dam down. And really, that's when the home voiceover industry really exploded, right about the millennium. And very famous people in the broadcast world, people like Don LaFontaine, who is the famously "In a World Where," that was Don LaFontaine. Don LaFontaine was one of the first guys who built a studio in his home and leveraged the power of new technologies like high-speed internet back then, which was done with a either a DSL modem or something like he was one of the first people to bring digital technology into the sphere and use it to build a very successful studio. And he made millions and millions of dollars in the latter years of his life just working from home. And broadcast also shifted at that time. We had people who were able to run entire radio empires from literally the middle of nowhere. The best example of that is the late Art Bell, who used to host Coast to Coast AM. You know, he was a low power FM and ham radio operator from back in the day who realized that with the right high speed internet access, he could run a nationally syndicated radio show. And he did so very successfully for many, many years. That getting the technology to support us working at home, that opened the door for literally hundreds of thousands of people. And that's why I'm here doing what I'm doing today.
One thing I've certainly noticed and is becoming more and more abundantly clear is there is a stark difference between radio and podcast. And you hear a lot of different things about, for example, radio is dead, radio is dying. And I still think it's very much alive, but now there is this kind of crossover that makes you kind of wonder, where is the line drawn? But I think one of the key considerations here is how a presenter voices things and how the show is done. Now, I know a lot of those factors aren't really presented on a podcast because, you know, you're not live. You don't have to consider a live audience. I know some podcasts are, but a lot of the time a podcast is just what we're doing, an interview type situation. So the host is more focused on getting a good conversation out of their guest rather than worrying about, you know, what the next song is going to be or like think about the next commercial that's coming up or whatever. Now, I'm interested to kind of get your perspective on this, coming over from radio into podcasting. Do you think, well, let's start with, what is your perspective on the majority of what podcasts are doing, like from the perspective of your background in radio?
Well, first off, I've been a podcast consumer for well over a decade. I go back, my internet history, one of the things that brought me out to the West Coast where I currently live from the Midwest was I started up a web development company in like 1994. I was, one of the first people. We were literally coding HTML on Notepad by hand,
Wow.
With dinosaurs looking over our shoulder. but I mention that because for me, the democratization of technology is, I mean, and we're experiencing right now, and I'm sure we'll talk about it before the show's over. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, I am very big in putting technology in the hands of the people, individuals who have their own points of view, who have their own views on the world and want to express them. I'm a huge fan of that. And at the same time, the unfettered, unrestricted development of technology that we're now, literally right now, as we record this in 2023, all our heads are spinning because of the rapid rise of things like generative AI, 11 Labs, and Midjourney and ChatGTP. These things are suddenly all around us in a more noticeable way. And it's making a lot of us kind of dizzy and very nervous. But really, I mention all that because I have been a technological person for a long time. And my history with internet audio goes back to things like Winamp and Real Video, I believe is what it was called. It was one of the first streaming video platforms. I was an early adopter. I was an early developer. And I, long ago, saw this coming and going, this is going to give people so many more voices to listen to hear. We're not going to be stuck with the same, well, you're in Europe, so you have a different palette. But back when I was growing up, we had 3 stations to watch on TV and maybe 4 to listen to on the radio. Now we're suffering from an embarrassment of media channels. I mean, and again, for good or not so much, because you can hear so many different voices, but at the same time, you can also very easily crawl into a very comfortable intellectual silo where you're only hearing things that reinforce and support your own views. And that can be dangerous. But overall, it's fantastic. The podcasts that I listen to, which are generally particular to me and, my niches of interest, being able to go out and find something that speaks to something that you thought you were alone in enjoying or being fascinated by or loving, that's an incredibly powerful and empowering experience, because suddenly you go, oh, I'm not alone. I'm not the only person. And that can be a really amazing and powerful and positive thing in somebody's life.
Completely agree. And one of the things that you were talking about there is something I have noticed, and it's split into 2 things. It's the double-edged sword argument that we sort of touched on before, but it's also, there is an oversaturation of podcasts. And one and one of the things about radio, which I think is still true to this day, people have said to me, why don't you get on radio? You have a voice for radio. It'd be great. And I'm like, well, yeah, but there's not an in. It's not like you just, I'll just go to broadcasting school and then I'll get in. I mean, I don't know if it's changed in the US, but here in the UK, as far as I can see, you have to be invited in. You have to have a certain level of prestige. You have to be known, I guess, as a celebrity or whatever. Not always, but generally speaking, I suppose the mindset there is, if this person is known, they'll bring a viewership initially with them, because it's business, it's numbers. Mm-hmm. However, you can make the same argument for podcasting, to be honest. And I don't know, when I started this podcast, I started it because I just wanted to do a podcast for years and years and years and years and years. And then I quickly came to realize, oh my gosh, you need a structure. You need to create a show. And I knew that from day one, and I was prepared from day one, but it's only throughout the course of the last sort of 3 years I've been doing this now that it's really kind of come into its own. Mm-hmm. And I've seen so many podcasts come and go. And every time I hear people say, I'm setting up a podcast, I'm like, all right, come back to me when you do your first 20.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's always the same. I see it all the time. Or sometimes it's even more frustrating. I'll see a really good show go for like 6 months and then they'll give up. Now, I'm not getting the numbers that I'd like to get on my podcast, but I tell you what I am getting is wonderful conversations and wonderful guests. And I just keep going because it's exciting to have these kind of conversations.
I'm glad to hear that you bring that facet of it up because, you know, I do a lot of, I consult with people and businesses who are wanting to get into this podcast thing. And, you know, the one thing that I put in front of them first before anything else is that this is work. This is real work. Bingo. And I was happy to hear you mention, you know, a podcast that you maybe start listening to that seems great and they do 40 shows and then suddenly poof, they're gone. Normally the poof, they're gone is when the guy who is saddled with the actual work goes, screw you guys. I'm taking my mics and I'm going home because this is way more work than I ever anticipated. Didn't sign up for. I thought we were going to have fun, and this has turned into a second job for me. That happens so frequently. And, you know, it's interesting because the bar to get into podcasting, as you know, is really low. You can do it almost for free, but you're going to come off like a freely done podcast. But the investment, you know, of like the platforms that we might have to use, things like that, $50 a month, literally like 4 Starbucks coffees a month, and you could be doing a halfway decent podcast. And many people flooded in, are still flooding. The flood is not done.
Oh, no.
You know, you get on Reddit and you get into the podcasting subreddits, and every single day there's 4, 5, 6, 10. I'm thinking of starting a podcast. I think it'd be cool. Kind of, and you know, all us people who've been doing it for years just sit back and look at our monitors and go, "Oh, you have no idea what you are getting yourself into."
Yep.
And, you know, that happens with any new kind of offering that makes itself visible in the world. A lot of people who have thought about it go, now's my chance. And that's true. Now's your chance. Now's your chance to prove that this is a thing that is truly valuable to you. And in any value proposition, you have to be willing to give something into it. And sometimes it's too much. Even for a simple podcast that's done, let's say generously that it's done twice a month, which is a not uncommon production cycle for a podcast. You're looking at, for a good podcast that's well researched and you prepare for it, you're looking at probably, right, there you go, this guy on the other side of the camera, you're looking at probably 10 hours a month dedicated to the production of your podcast. And that's if you're going lightly, for me. And that includes the recording and the production time. But if you really want to be successful at this, you need to want to do it for the right reasons. And it's the reason that you stated. I love having conversations with people as well. That's why I have my podcasts. That is the first reason why I have my podcast. It certainly isn't money, because I'm leaking money hand over fist in order to do stuff like this. It's certainly not for fame, because I'm anything but famous. Even notoriety. It's hard to get visibility in the podcast sphere, expressly because you are one fish in a massive shoal of people. So you've got to want to do it for some other impractical reason. I love talking to people. I find this rewarding. I'd like to think that I'm putting something good out into the world. Those reasons are the reasons why podcasts stay in production. And honestly, in my opinion, those are the reasons why podcasts maybe eventually wind up being successful. Because that kind of enthusiasm for the mission, that comes through to the listener. That comes through to the viewer. You know, my largest podcast product is one, we got a handful of viewers and listeners, but we keep doing it. Mostly because me and the other 3 people involved, we need to be able to hang out with each other at least once a month and kind of just do a reality check and check in with friends. It kept us all sane during lockdown in the pandemic, where we're suddenly able to see people that we care about, and that a byproduct of that is something that everybody else can watch and hopefully enjoy. Is just that. It's a byproduct. We always say we're going to keep doing this until we don't feel like doing it. And if we don't feel like doing it for you, we'll probably still do it for ourselves, because these are three of my friends and I sitting around trying to have a decent conversation about watching the world burn, so.
No, I agree with you completely. I remember I was talking about this recently. I set myself a goal that I would do the show for 10 years. I'm 3 years in. And the reason for that is, started in 2020. I figured I can do a decade. Why not? Everyone else gives up at like first 10 or 20. Why not be the difference? And so the first thing I want to say to that is that I've noticed now, whenever I talk about the fact that I've got over 200 episodes, people seem to look at that differently now. I think the first response generally is, oh, you got a podcast. Like, everyone and their mum has got a podcast,
Right.
I mean? But when you say something like that, it's a bit like saying that I've got a degree or something. It's like it tells the person that you're talking to that you're serious about this, that this is something that means something to you. And as you said, that when you have that kind of enthusiasm for what you're doing, that will come through in the work. And I look back at my older episodes throughout the years, and I can see that I got better with it through practice, but I think more because I just had the right shift in mindset. I don't think about the numbers anymore. I get down about the numbers. That's true.
Sure.
And my listeners will, they get annoyed about me sometimes mentioning this. But what you said there about having a handful of listeners that actually care, that's what I was always looking out for. It was never, if there's 1,000 people or 10,000 people, is, are there just a handful of people that care? And once I realized there are some people that care, and those people continually like send in questions and are interested, I'm like, right, okay, that's who I'm making the show for.
Right.
But then also throughout the course of making this show, and I've said this many times, so I'll cliff notes this, it is about sharing the stories and getting good content out there and telling stories, sharing stories, everything in between that. And speaking of which, I want to draw it back to you.
Fantastic segue, by the way. That was totally pro.
I wish, man. I'd love to do what you do and get into radio and all that stuff, but I don't know that it'd be the same now, because I think, like, as I said,
don't either.
Yeah, it's not the same, really, is it?
Mm-mm.
It's one thing that confuses me, actually. I don't know if you have this in the States, but I hear a lot of the time when you go listen to like a radio station, they'll start plugging that they have a podcast. Like, oh, hey, listen to this latest.
That is absolutely a movement here as well.
What is that?
I think more than it, because, okay, first off, for your listeners on, your continental listeners, there's a dramatic difference between broadcast in Europe and particularly in the UK and broadcast here.
Yep.
In the UK, you have the Beeb, and then you've got a couple other players. And your couple other players actually only came in relatively recently. The decentralization of broadcast and allowing more broadcasters in than just the BBC really is is something that came out of the pirate radio movement in the UK back in the 70s and 80s, with KISS and all that stuff. So for you guys, a decentralization of broadcasting is only really about 30 or 40 years old. Here in the United States, every broadcaster was an independent broadcaster until the Federal Communications Commission started centralizing certain aspects of broadcast. And we had lots of restrictions, not as many as in the UK. But what happened from that is our television stations became more powerful than our radio stations by way of mass appeal right around 1970. And in that time, a lot of our television stations bought independent radio stations and brought them in under their corporate umbrella. And then what happened in the 80s with the decentralization and the the FCC changed a lot of regulations, so deregulation happened, and then we had these massive corporate conglomerates buying up all the radio and television stations. And what wound up happening was that we went from a very independent broadcast model to a very restricted broadcast model. 1, 2, 3 companies owned all the broadcast in the United States. Clear Channel, iHeartRadio, these large corporate entities bought up everything. And I think what really happened, to come back to your question about why they're all pushing podcasts now, is those large corporate entities went, wait a minute, we can't have the public knowing that there's still independent voices to listen to. Take a memo. Have somebody in legal check out what this podcast thing is about. We need one of those. And so it's really just a co-opting. It's getting in on the trend, and at the same time, it's protecting their audience, because they were losing audience because people aren't commuting as much. They're not spending as much time in their cars going to and from their big glass and concrete box offices and then back home. And so if they're not listening to the radio, what are they listening to? Oh, the iPod. What is that? It's this little thing you can carry in your pocket and listen to whatever you want. Oh, do they have shows? Well, there's this new thing called a podcast, and you can get them on that as well. Oh, wait, my phone can do that now? Okay. And so it was suddenly giving the power of choice back to the listener. And corporations aren't really a fan of that. So, yeah, the larger networks here were very quick to get in on podcasting. And interestingly, the first group to really leverage the power of the podcast by way of being a broadcaster was our version, I guess, a little bit of the BBC. We have something here in the States called NPR, which is National Public Radio.
Yeah.
And some of the most famous show I think that anybody in Europe might know of is a show called This American Life. And it is really what podcasts often are now, but way back in the day. This American Life is about 25 years old. And its announcer, Ira Glass, is really one of the people who saw that, well, I want people to hear my story. And I don't necessarily want them to be tethered to a time and a place. So let's take our shows and turn them into this podcast thing so people can listen to them whenever they want. And all the other larger corporate stations and conglomerates went, well, it seems to be working for them. Get on that. And that's really where we are now. Almost everything that is a radio program is now available, downloadable as a podcast, because the cost to do it is virtually nothing. You've already done the audio. You already own the studio. You've already produced everything. Just dump it out as an MP3 and your reach is extended.
Okay. Is it just me though? Or, because I've not really come across any kind of corporately produced shows like that I actually could sit and listen to. I mean, there are exceptions, with the ones that follow more of a documentarian style of storytelling, or guests that they have over and stuff like that. That's different. Well, you know what I'm going for here, like entertainment, so to speak. It's always very kind of like, I just get a vibe of laziness. Like when I think of the top podcast out there across any platform, chances are they're independent, or they've been now bought by a podcast network or a network or something like that. But interestingly, the ones that opt to go with networks or get bought out in some shape or form, they always change like that straight away.
Yeah. I think there are some examples of staying independent and being successful. I think the largest one would probably be WTF with Mark Maron. While Mark does and famously takes sponsor money, He has fought tooth and nail. He could very easily have gone, not to drop another name, he could have very easily gone the Joe Rogan route and allowed himself to be bought up by Spotify for $100 million. That's what Rogan sold his podcast for, $100 million.
Do you happen to know, though, if they have, like, I don't want to say like creative control, but can they tell him what he can and can't put out there?
They can't tell him what to say on mic, but they are absolutely in control of what gets out to the public.
Right.
And there have been instances with Rogan where Spotify has faced some serious backlash.
I've seen some of that, yeah.
Unsurprisingly with Rogan, and have had to take down episodes or redact certain things in episodes in order to, appease their investors, frankly. Marin, on the other hand, is vociferously independent, and is, he'll take sponsorship money, but his sponsors know up front, I'm going to say dirty words, and they might be about your product. I'm going to do it in such a way that my audience understands that I'm being funny, but you got to be cool with that in order to ride with me. So there's examples of both. There are outliers in both dynamics as well. But overall, the thing that I kind of get concerned about with podcasting does reach back to what we were talking about the ones that I like the most are the ones where the broadcaster is passionate and is doing something that they love to do. We also have this mentality in podcasting now with the bigger properties where it feels like what I refer to collectively as the Microsoft angle. Build something good enough that eventually Microsoft will sweep in and buy you up. And then you get your payday, because honestly, for the majority of podcasts and the vast majority of podcasts, not only don't make any money, they actually cost the producer, they cost the podcaster money to do, as we were saying in the beginning. So suddenly being offered $1 million for a 2-person podcast sounds pretty attractive, because you know what? Even if the contract is for 2 years, you can do it for 2 years and everybody walks away, both you people walk away with $500,000. That sounds attractive. And that mentality still exists in the podcast world. Be good enough to get bought, do it for a while, and then go about your day. And that's good and bad, because honestly, it's bad because you might lose a product that you enjoy. But it's good because for me, those people are not the people that I want to invest my emotional capital in, because if that's the only reason why you're there, why am I listening to you if all you're waiting to do is be bought out? So, there are both that way. And at the same time, somebody rocks up to my front door and says, here's $1 million to do a podcast for a year. I'll talk to you in a year, and I'll be talking to you from a different set of digs, and it's going to look really cool.
I got to say that something like that does seem quite alluring. Like just for a year. Do you know what I mean? You could sort of toe the line a little bit.
You can't come off to me as being so ethical and holier than thou that's not going to make anybody stop, pump the brakes, and go, yeah, okay, sure.
Here's what I do. I have 2 shows, right? I've got a show, the Christian Reeve Podcast, completely free, always will be, unless I get bored up. Right. And then I've got a show called Life with Christian Reeve, which is more just all about me. It's on my Patreon. It's a different show, different angle, different feel.
Sure.
If I was bought out for like a year or 2, I would just have 2 different offerings and be like, this is what this is going to be. It might not be, it might be a bit different because it's more commercialized, but this offering over here, totally different. And that's how I'd split it up. And I don't know. I think it depends how much your show changes. Because like for example, there's a show here in the UK called the Happy Hour Podcast.
Right.
And they started.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. So they started out as just a YouTuber podcast, and it's a great. It's actually one of the few podcasts that I like where I don't listen to it anymore, just too busy with my stuff. But
Right.
I look at it and I look at their progression, and it's a kind of a fair progression. They stepped it up. They realized they could do more with it. They got more money,
Oh yeah,
from
and
sponsorships and
they
stuff.
improved it as they went along, which was for me was its own reward, because I like seeing people with good ideas be able to get better at what they do. You
Right.
know,
Yeah, and I think like the interesting thing is now that they've kind of gone commercial, they've gone with Spotify and everything. I wouldn't say that they've quote unquote like sold out. It's just that the show has a different vibe now. Like now they're getting like big celebrity guests.
yeah, legit celebrities. Yeah,
Right. And it's like now, I suppose the only kind of negative aspect to it would be that, and this is, I've always been about with my podcast, it's all about the conversation. I'm like, people have asked, why don't you have celebrities? I've had people that are successful, have massive followings online. I guess I've not really had like quote unquote celebrities.
right.
But I wouldn't really be interested because just having a celebrity doesn't guarantee you anything. Just on a side
Very
note,
true.
guys, I've seen
Yeah.
that happen on other people's shows. It did nothing for them. Secondly, why would I want a guest who is restricted on what they can say?
Right.
Seems pointless to me.
Yeah.
Unless I know for definite I can ask this person whatever I want. And here's the thing: I don't do a show where I'm looking to catch people out.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? I just want
I
to.
hate that.
Yeah, I just want to tell that person's story and have fun with it and make them feel comfortable.
Yeah.
But I've heard of so many instances of like people talking to someone's PR agent. And they're like, "Oh, you can't ask them this,
Right.
can't ask them that."
The list of verboten things. Yeah.
That reminds me, actually, a couple of years ago, I did actually reach out to a celebrity, and she got back to me, and it was really cool, and it looked like it was going to happen. And she made me jump through all these hoops only for it to not happen. And one of those hoops was to write out a list of all the questions I was going to ask her. And I never do that because, because back then I was beginning to ad lib a lot. Now I pretty much just ad lib the whole thing. I barely look at my notes. But back then I was learning to do that. And I was like, well, how can I? I know I'm going to do that. But I did it anyway. I acquiesced and I sent it over. She perused them. She said, great, this is brilliant. And then she just kept fobbing me off. And eventually I was like, after the third or fourth time, I was like, fine then.
Yeah.
Whatever. Because it's just like, do you know what I mean? Like, okay, so
I think any podcaster who is trying to reach out and get other people to come in has had an experience like that to one degree or another. Yes, I have certainly. Or I've been promised one person in email conversation, and another person shows up who is, unwilling. They're the same person, but their interaction with me in email is very positive, and then they get on, and it's just like a cold fish in front of the camera. And I recently interviewed a very prestigious professor of ethics and technology in Berlin, Germany, and I said my show is about an hour. They said you can have a half hour. I'm like, okay, I'll do that. And then when they did wind up being on the show, they really weren't answering my questions. They were just going through their talking points. And I'm like you. I do my research. I do some planning. I have a process, but at the same time, I want my conversation to be organic, and I want it to flow, and I want it to go where the conversation is taking us. And getting somebody in a podcasting environment who really is more comfortable talking from a podium and taking questions from reporters it's a very different vibe. It's a very different flow, and sometimes it just winds up being awkward AF, and you just kind of have to throw your hands up.
Well, let me ask you this, because I've had a similar experience. I've had that like twice. One of the times this person was like really pushing their products and services. So like I remember it was to do with along the lines of mental health. And one of the questions I asked was like, what's the first thing you would suggest to people going through X, Y, and Z problem? And the very first thing they said was, oh, well, I direct them to this page on my website. Da, 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 da. And I'm thinking in my head, I'm like, really? That's the first thing
Yeah.
you do? It's like, oh, hey, buy my thing.
Did you have the sound of money going off in the background?
I was
Because,
like, please. And it was a good convo in total, but that stuff irked me. I was like, look, I know that this is about promotion. I get that. But the best way to promote yourself is to put yourself out there. Like whenever I appear on people's shows, you don't hear me like spend the whole hour going, oh, you can follow me here, you can do this, you can do that. Like I barely do it.
Just pointing at yourself all the time. Yeah, that comes off. That comes off like it comes off when people do that. It's always it makes you come off as very self-aggrandizing and very self-important. And no, if I'm on somebody else's show like yours, I am like, I want to talk about what you want to talk about, because that's the thrust of the show. And frankly, I find that more compelling. I wanted to make a mention of something, though, that I think is really salient. And that is, when you're talking about the difference between big podcasts that have been bought by some platform versus independent, if you really enjoy a podcast or a YouTube channel, support it. This drives me absolutely bananas. And it's not because I don't get support. I get support. I have supporters. I get some financial support in order to keep doing what I'm doing, but the vast majority of the finances are on my shoulders. But for those podcasts that you really enjoyed that suddenly disappeared or went away, I am willing to put a shilling on the fact that they say, and please do us a favor, like, click, and subscribe. And you can always support us on our Patreon page or on our Ko-fi page or any of a number of other micro donation support platforms. If that podcast disappeared on you, it's on you as well. It's on you as a consumer, and I don't fault anybody for being bought by Spotify, because one good thing that does come out of it is that those people, those producers, are able to keep doing what they're doing. Yes, it might be different by way of corporate constraints and a few of the things that you might be able to get away with, but they found a way to make it financially viable. And so I don't have a problem with that, unless, like you, the thing changes in tone and tenor so much that it's just a shell of what it used to be. But for those small producers that you really like, or those that are just consistently giving you quality stuff, support them. Take $5 a month, one less fancy coffee out in the world a month, and give it to them. Because I will tell you, if 10 people do that for a small podcast, that's $50 a month that will help keep that product afloat. It will pay for the platform, the aggregator platform that puts the podcast out in the world. It will help pay for a better microphone, so you don't constantly have to listen to them sounding like somebody's there with cello wrap, going kind of. Those little things actually matter. And I am a huge advocate in these days, kind of reaching back to what we were talking about corporate ownership of things. I am a fan of the democratization of media. I drive my wife nuts because I won't watch television. I won't watch a movie. I've been a consumer of these things that culture or society tells me is important for the vast majority of my life. I'm 55 years old. And up until I was maybe 45, the media that I consumed was that which was put in front of me. But now, with YouTube, I'm a massive fan of YouTube, and I follow many different content creators on YouTube. People like Adam Savage, the guy that used to be on Mythbusters. His channel Tested. That helped keep me sane during the pandemic. I'm a woodworker and a machinist and a couple other creative mechanical things. And I watch people like restoring old tools or restoring furniture, things like that. I'd much rather watch that. I'd much rather support somebody who's giving me something that I find intellectually, spiritually, emotionally rewarding. And so I feel it's fair for me to help out and pay them so they can have the good camera, so that it looks nice, so they can have the right equipment, the $400 microphone, so that they can sound good. We are spoiled for choice. And really, we should be more fair in supporting those people who put good things in our life. The days of everything being free or having to buy a TV license only, those are gone. And honestly, I'm not super upset about it because, and you'll get a kick out of this, because now I get to watch Taskmaster.
Yeah.
I get to watch Taskmaster on YouTube. Or something like I got my wife hooked on our tea time thing is we watch Richard Osman's House of Games because we're just nerds like that. Or 8 out of 10 Cats does Countdown. Huge fan. Okay, I'm a bit of an Anglophile. I wouldn't be able to watch any of that stuff were it not for things like YouTube. Or one of my favorite podcasts is No Such Thing as a Fish, which of course is the Elves crew from QI. And there are no international barriers anymore. I've got listeners and viewers in Kuala Lumpur and Dubai and, all over the world. I would never have gotten in front of them, and I would never have learned as much about their cultures. And so I support them. I pay them a little bit of money every month. It's much better than, paying a TV license for a bunch of stuff that I have no real interest in unless it's maybe on Dave, So support people, really, honestly. Just take a little bit of your money and help them out because they're giving you something.
There you go, guys. There's a reason to subscribe to my Patreon. You heard it from Andrew himself.
There you go. Exactly right.
It's funny. I don't actually push people to support this show for my Patreon. I've always kind of just pushed my Patreon on other platforms, like when I do my live streams and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe I should start doing it. I mean, I don't know. It's
a hard ask because it makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah,
it absolutely does. Okay, and at the same time, though, there is some shared equity in this experience. If people are enjoying what you do, you would want their support. It would be nice to have their support. And at the same time, you're not asking for something that you're just going to burn. Okay? We're not talking about something like some big YouTube person who literally just takes the ad revenue money and goes out and buys a ridiculous car to show on their next video. That bougie kind of thing, the baller mentality. I support people who actually give me something in return. And I believe in that support because I don't want it to go away. So if I don't want something to go away, there's some responsibility on me to provide for it. And I do. And I mean, I'm not, burning off $400 a month in all the support. I'd love to be able to do that. I'd love to be able to sweep in and say, oh, I hear your podcast, you broke your equipment, here's $400 for something new. I can't do that. But I certainly can, peel off $1 or $2 a month in order to just chip in and help out. But the ask is always uncomfortable. The ask is just like, it immediately goes off in your head. I'm just this little guy. I don't want to ask for money. That sounds creepy and kind of self-entitled or self-important. No, it doesn't. This is how the world works. And it's your right to ask for help if that's what keeps the boat afloat. But at the same time, if nobody's willing to help and you're still passionate about it, full steam ahead, just keep doing it anyway for your own sake. And if other people jump on, that's great. And that's really my model. I'm going to do it. If you want to help, that's totally cool, and I'd really appreciate it. But I'm going to be here tomorrow doing this thing because this is what I do. This is who I am. And I'd appreciate the help, but I won't judge you if you can't or won't. End of story.
It's interesting. I've been going through a pretty hard time in my life lately, and it's sometimes funny to me how the coincidence of things or how certain things come to you and you need to hear those things at a certain time. I think I needed to hear this conversation today.
I'm I'm happy to I'm happy to be the dad in the situation here and say, nah, son, you go out and you put your hand out and say you either shake it or you shake it or grease it.
I see. I just about got to the point where I'm able to ask people to subscribe to the Patreon, and that took me a while.
All right, baby steps. Okay.
Yeah, like I mean, with that, at least I'm producing a show exclusive for them. In my mind, I was like, that makes sense. I do have things like a PayPal and an Amazon wish list and stuff, but I said this in a live stream recently. Like, I feel so like you'll never hear me going like, oh, give me money, give me money, give me money. I'll always say something like, if you would like to support me, this is how you can do it.
Yeah,
but I never demand it. But I do see a lot of people demand it, and sometimes they'll say things like, oh, if you don't do this, then the show can't continue, or if you don't do this, then I can't keep doing this. And it's like, get a job, like. Do you know what I mean? Like,
if it comes down to that, you know, that's an approach that it makes me uncomfortable as well. I'll totally back you on that. But the other thing that happens there, though, is that failure might be an important lesson for the producer, because if people aren't willing to help, if people don't find value in what you're doing, I mean, your reoccurring people who are supporters, if they are not willing to do so, that actually points to your content. That points to the quality of your content. And you can be as heartfelt as you want, but if you're not giving somebody value in a value proposition, and that's what podcasting is a value proposition, then as the producer, that's a really important bellwether. That is maybe I got to step back and think about how I'm doing this, what I'm putting out there. Why are people willing to consume it but not support it? And that's an important thing for a producer to keep in mind, because there's good ideas done okay, and then there's good ideas that are brought to their fullest potential. And if you're giving people the first one, most people aren't going to pay for that. If you're doing the latter and you come to people for whatever reason and say, look, we're really in a pinch. We'd love to be able to keep doing this at the same quality level, but we need your help. Remember earlier on in our conversation, I talked about National Public Radio. National Public Radio in the United States is funded by the public. It's funded by donations. And so at least 3 times a year on National Public Radio, they have funding drives where they do say that is their tack. If you don't support us, we're going to go off the air, because we don't get government money. We don't get support from the government as the National Public Radio. We get paid by you people and by our sponsorships. And we're asking for you to pay for the value that we provide in your life. But you got to have some value in what you're putting out there before you step up and tell your audience, if you don't help, this is going away. So
see, that though is different from like an individual person essentially guilt tripping, because that right there is more talking about the consequences. It's like, this is what's going to happen, but it's not kind of implying that if people don't do it, they're like bad people for not supporting the show.
No, I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like, I totally get where you're coming from, and I think
that's why I'm saying
awesome.
That's why I'm saying there's a level to which it's appropriate to take that tack, and then there's not. And if you're some dude sitting in your garage, you know, with all respect to Mark Maron, I mean, because Mark Maron literally had Barack Obama, the sitting president of the United States, come into his garage. You know, he has a famous story about, like, neighbors across the street had to allow snipers from, you know, the Secret Service up on the roof while Obama was in his garage doing the podcast. Oh, yeah. Yeah. You know, unless you're a real going concern, unless you've got thousands of listeners, thousands and thousands of listeners and downloads a month, you don't really have any leverage to say, look, you should pay for this. You should pay. I'm giving you something. Now, there's a way to do it and a way not, and that's definitely a way not. I'm much more in your camp, where I say, if you want to, cool. If not, again, I'm still going to be here because my overhead is low. I don't have the overhead of running a podcast, that necessitates 10 people doing something in order to produce it. Everything I do is either one or two people by way of production. That's why I have a Ko-fi or a Buy Me a Coffee where, hey, man, if you really like this episode, do us a favor, get the like, click, subscribe on. And if you want to throw us a couple bucks, you can go over here. And, we get that every once in a while. And interestingly, I notice that we get it when our material is very compelling, where people get something from that value proposition and go, yeah, you know what? I could tell you guys really work this thing. So yeah, here's $5. Thanks a lot for doing it. That was cool. But yeah, the whole give me money or else. Nah, most people are going to say, or else, thanks. Peace out.
Just to put a kind of a bow on that part of the podcast, I just wanted to ask, what would you say are the kind of key takeaways for you and lessons from podcasting and radio work?
Honestly, I do think that it's the passion of the person doing it. That comes through. That is something that I honestly don't think you can fake. And, even one of the other things that we're suffering or benefiting from, however you choose to look at it, these days is lots of famous people now have podcasts, right? Yeah. I mean, yeah. And, some of it's good. Some of them are good. Some of them are like, oh, really? Really? I just got to hear you talk like this now? No, thanks. And in the UK, pretty much if you're a working comedian these days in the UK, you have a podcast, right? And some of them are great. I'm a huge fan of Rod Gilbert and his wife's podcast. I think it is one of the cutest things on earth. I'm happy to hear that Rod Gilbert's coming back from his cancer diagnosis again. It was quite significant, but he seems to be doing better. Famous people podcasts for me always feel they teeter on disingenuous. They teeter on overexposure. I am all places all the time, and I've got something to say. Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. I don't need to just hear you waffle. But at the same time, with the sheer amount of podcasts available, you can hear somebody when they're truly being genuine. And you can easily go out and find examples of other podcasts trying to do that, but it just doesn't feel that way. I go for the genuine. I'm a junkie of the genuine. When you are talking about something that you're truly passionate about, when you're emotional about something, when you're willing to strip everything away and be kind of intellectually or emotionally naked with somebody and let the rest of the world in on it. Those are the things that I find truly rewarding as a person, as a consumer of media. And that's what I think is the core tenet of a successful podcaster or a successful producer. If you put something out there that's genuine, more likely than not, it's going to resonate with somebody. Now, if it doesn't resonate with enough somebody's, that's a different issue. But really the key for me is coming on and being real and doing something that you are truly motivated to do, that you really enjoy. That's the reason why I keep doing one of my podcasts, simply because I enjoy doing it. And if other people want to come along, that's fine. And that's what I encourage people to go search out and find. Voices who resonate with you, voices who make you feel good hearing. And again, support them. Support them either by like, click, subscribe, which is a much more powerful tool than many people realize. Our lives as producers are measured by those thumbs, right? And click-through rates. And if all we're asking you to do, even if you're not willing to pay us any money, if you could just like and maybe suggest this to somebody else, that's got a value to us. And it's a free thing for you to do in order to support us. But you got to be passionate about this weird thing that we do, or else You're just another source of noise in the world.
Speaking of voices,
Yeah.
let's look into your work as a voiceover artist and voice actor. I obviously have a hand in this. I'm very intrigued. I've been doing voiceover work and voice acting for about 4 years, but this ain't about me. This is about you. So let's hear it. What have been the high points, low points? Walk us through what it's like to be a voiceover artist and actor.
Well, sure. I have a lot of stage training from when I was younger. I was trained to sing opera at a young age, and I performed musical theater and that. So I have a performance background by way of my voice. Part of that training was acting, but my acting training is the lesser of all my trainings from back in the day. But really, I got into voice art. As I said, I was working. I came out to the West Coast at the tech boom of the millennium, and I worked a large corporate job that paid me a lot of money, and I hated it. I hated it so much with a white-hot burning passion. So I switched out of that. I did a bunch of other things, and one of the things that I'll mention to your audience is that I'm a disabled man. When I was 15 years old, I had a disabling accident. I broke my neck in a diving accident.
Oh my God.
And so I suffered partial paralysis, and I have since then. So I can't go out and do a lot of jobs that other people can. I have a number of physical limitations. One of the things that's not been limited my entire life is my voice and my ability to read and speak. And that was always something that was very enticing to me. You mean I can work from home and I can make money just by reading goodly? I'll do that, and it was always very interesting to me. I had been working a number of phone jobs for nonprofit organizations, arts-based organizations in my area. And in 2014, I got fired for the first and only time in my life from a telemarketing job that I absolutely despised. And was back home waiting for my then partner and told them about losing the job and said, I think I want to try voice acting full time. Now, one of two things happens in that dynamic in a couple. You either get support or you get the eye roll. And can't you just get a real job? Fortunately, this person that I was with saw the wisdom in allowing me to try. And I had a broken Mac laptop. The screen didn't work. The keyboard didn't work. The trackpad didn't work. So I had to use an external keyboard, external mouse, external monitor. But it had GarageBand on it. Hey. And I knew that I could record in GarageBand. And I went out. I didn't even have a microphone at the time. That was not what was in my life at the time. So I went out and I got off of somebody selling it used on the internet. I went out and I got a blue Snowball microphone. And within 2 weeks, I'd done my first $250 spot for a large governmental organization here in the United States, the National Park Service. And that kind of rubber stamped this can actually be a real thing. And my partner at the time went, well, apparently this really is a thing. And within the next month, I got my first audiobook job, which was $1,000, which was just like mind-blowing at the time. Very interestingly, it was for an organization that is both important to me and accidentally references your name, Christian, because it was for the Christopher Reeve Foundation. And Christopher Reeve, of course, very famously was the 1980s version of Superman, but who broke their neck in a horse riding accident and was paralyzed for the rest of his life until he sadly passed away. And that organization is an organization that, as a person with a spinal injury, I was already very familiar with. And I was very excited to do the work for them and extra excited for $1,000. And that job, pardon my French, that chewed my ass like bubble gum. I was in so far over my head I didn't know what I was doing. This was literally like reading the phone book. Instead of phone numbers, it was URLs that I had to read out. Blah, 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 dot slash colon at sign, but just, it was horrific. But I got through it. I learned a lot of things. I learned how to apologize profusely, how to beg for more time, how to blame technology for all the problems. But I stuck with it.
Yeah.
And my business and my offerings have grown since then. And I have bunches of audiobooks that I've narrated up on audible.com. And my voice is heard around the world. I'm the voice of a 1.4 million subscriber YouTube channel that deals with MMA and sports. And so, you know, I'm literally, my voice is heard around the globe, which still feels a little weird when I stop to think about it. But I also I've done work for like large universities with big automated phone systems where they've got, 200 people working there, and, press 4 now for, that kind of thing. And yeah, it's something that I enjoy doing. And it's something that I enjoy teaching people how to do, because one of the other things is that I'm a voiceover coach. So if somebody is interested in getting into this business, they can take voice lessons with me. They can learn the business side of things or the technological side of things. And one of the outgrowths of my business has been my YouTube channel, which is called the VO Booth Camp. And for those interested, shameless plug. For those interested, you can find me on YouTube at the VO Booth Camp. And that's what my channel is about. I've got about 70 videos up there covering everything from technique. I do gear reviews, microphone reviews, and comparison videos. And I also have a podcast based on that called Booth to Booth, which is both a video podcast, a fully produced video podcast, and just a standalone audio podcast where I interview big people in the VO realm. I just interviewed Robert Chiampaglia, who is a voiceover lawyer, and we spend a lot of time talking about intellectual rights as they pertain to the encroachment of artificial intelligence in voiceover. I've had Mike Del Gaudio, who is very famous on YouTube as the Booth Junkie. He does a lot of gear reviews, and he's a compatriot of mine, and he was on a couple of my podcasts, and I was on his. Voiceover and voice production is one of the most rewarding things in my life. Being able to use my voice as a voice for good, and not only that, but help people do the same thing. I find that immensely rewarding.
What do you think of the key kind of qualities that a successful voiceover artist or voice actor needs to be successful?
I'm going to divorce them just a little bit between voice artist and voice actor, and I'm going to totally smear it around as well. We really have two types of things that we do in voice work. We do narration, or what's often referred to as VO, voiceover, which fair to say that it's kind of what people envision an announcer to be, the guy that's announcing the thing. And then we have voice acting. And voice acting, people think of like doing dubs for, offshore anime being broadcast in English-speaking languages, or being the voice of a movie in a cartoon movie voice, things like that. So they're slightly different, but at the same time, I also admonish people that all voice artistry is voice acting. If you're not saying thoughts that are occurring to you in real time in your head and they're coming out of your face hole, if you're saying somebody else's words, you're voice acting, because you are trying to convey an emotional arc that another person's mind came up with. The message is theirs. Your job is to communicate that message in all its ways to somebody else. And that's acting. That's just acting. Really, for me, this ties in nicely with our discussion of what makes a good podcast. For voice artistry, it's being genuine. People want to hear a genuine voice. And we've moved very far away. I mean, I go back further than you, but you can probably even remember when you were a young kid towards around about the millennium, we moved away from this very announcery kind of voice to just the dude next door talking to you. And being able to bring a genuine voice, be articulate, have emotion, those things are what the world wants right now when it comes to communicating, whether it's commercial communication, entertainment. The genuine has come back in vogue. And so being confident in your voice, being confident in your abilities, being able to modulate, bring intonation, inflection, diction, those kinds of things. We all think that we could do this because I have a mouth, I can talk. Well, yeah, but do you talk goodly? Do you get people to affiliate with you when you're talking? People don't affiliate with artificial voices. People do affiliate with real human voices. And of course, that's even more significant now as we're moving into this age of generative AI, which is something that I've, in all my properties, that's all anybody's been allowing me to talk about for about the past 3 months, is the impact of artificial intelligence on narration and audiobook production. So still a hot topic.
So let's go there. What are your thoughts on how AI is going to take our jobs from us?
Unfortunately, I am not wearing my Skynet t-shirt today. It's weird. My industry is finding itself in a very interesting place right now because we really are kind of canaries in the coal mine. We are one of the first visible places where people are starting to lose jobs to artificial intelligence. One of the people that I support as a content creator is a fellow Brit of yours, Tom Scott. And I follow Tom Scott, I have for years. I think he's brilliant. He came out with a video about a month ago, and I encourage you to put it in the show notes. And it was called, I Tried Artificial Intelligence, It Scared Me. And what he was really talking about was what we in voiceover are experiencing right now. I get a lot of blowback from people in the voiceover realm who say, oh, artificial intelligence voices aren't that good. You can totally tell they sound really stilted and fake. And I'm like, yeah, now, right this second, they still do. How long do you think it's actually going to take somebody to make a synthesized voice that is virtually indistinguishable from a flesh and blood human? And Tom gave the world a great way to look at this. Mathematically, we have two kinds of growth that we're really regularly familiar with. We have one that's referred to as logarithmic growth, where things shoot up and then they top off pretty rapidly. And then thanks to the coronavirus pandemic, we're all very familiar with the other kind of growth model, which is called exponential growth, where just things go thump. If you combine those two growth graphs, you get what's referred to in statistics and modeling as a sigmoid curve, where things shoot up and then they top off at some point in the future. And what Tom Scott pointed out was something that was incredibly illuminating for me. By way of artificial voices and generative AI, we're down at the Napster moment of technological progression. And for those of you listeners out there who aren't familiar, back after the turn of the millennium, around 2007, 2008, we get something called Napster, which is file sharing. And suddenly people are able to get music on their mobile devices or on their computers that they want to listen to. And the entire industry freaked out. The music industry freaked out because how are we going to make our millions of dollars worth of money? And within 5 years, Napster was gone. Spotify was born. And now, when was the last time you went out and bought a CD? We don't do that anymore. We don't physically sell music anymore. All respect to you vinyl nerds out there. Love you guys. Totally see you. But we pay for a Spotify subscription, and we have our entire collection of music with us wherever we go, either in the cloud or via MP3 on our phone. This change is going to happen so rapidly, and it is now. We're to this place now where I, unfortunately, already had my voice cloned without my permission.
Interesting.
A number of very visible VO educators on YouTube have had that happen. Why? Because we put our voices up on YouTube all the time, and all one of these platforms needs is 2 minutes of you speaking. And interestingly, when I played it to my wife said, "It doesn't sound like you, but it sounds like what I think your brother might sound like." And that's scary enough to me. There's a voiceover talent in Northern Ireland who has their voice is being used as a voice model that can be paid for on a generative AI platform, and they didn't know about it. They did not know that their voice was being used that way. And that's because they did a job in a fashion in our industry that we refer to as FBO, or full buyout. They did the work, they sent it to the client, and they did not retain any rights, any prohibition rights to it. That client could use it however they wanted. That client decided to sell it to a generative AI platform that now offers it for sale. And one of this talent's friends called and said, "You sold your voice to an AI platform?" And she went, "No, I didn't." And he sent her the link, and sure enough, it's totally her voice. Interestingly, though, they even advertise it as a neutral, pleasant Irish voice. And the image of the person supposedly providing the voice is a admittedly lovely senior Asian lady. So there's a lot of shenanigans going on right now. And unfortunately, yeah, we're going to feel the impact in the audiobook world first, because there are plenty of titles of audiobooks that are a drag to narrate. Nobody wants to narrate all 18 volumes of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. It's just, but Apple is experimenting with AI voices for narration. Audible is experimenting with voices for AI narration. YouTube is really where it's showing up. Lots of small content creators, it's very attractive to them. $20, and they can generate the audio from the script they've already written in seconds. I don't charge $20. I charge considerably more than $20. And so those smaller content creators are going, "Yeah, that sounds like, I like that. I'll listen to that." And so the choices are starting to be made on whether or not human beings are worth it. And that's concerning to me.
Oh man.
Sorry to sponsor an existential crisis for you.
No, I already kind of knew about this. Funnily enough, I got off a call earlier today, or I've been talking a lot about this with various different businesses lately. Mm-hmm. And I spoke to one business about how it's going to affect content production as far as writing is concerned.
Oh yeah.
I'm very worried about it from here, and I've heard of instances like what you're talking about. And one thing I wanted to just ask you about is, have you taken any action towards that company or person or whoever who cloned your voice? I mean, because this raises a very important question, and I spoke about this in the show about 10 episodes ago. I did a show with a man called Craig Blackmore, who does a lot of like AI art and stuff like that. And we got on the topic of AI and AI art. Specifically, we were talking about licensing, and he kind of said like, well, enjoy it while it lasts, because eventually you're going to have to pay licenses to use these AI platforms. Bringing it back to what we're talking about now, I mean, essentially we're going to have to like patent copyright our voices. That's the only way you can really get around this. So
Yeah.
is
And
that
unfortunately, you can't. You cannot copyright or trademark your voice, at least in the States.
interesting?
Interestingly, uh, there are certain agencies who are starting to take action on this. The EU has an artificial intelligence. It's not a mandate, but it's more like a guideline. And the UK is currently working on directives towards artificial intelligence, particularly generative AI. Here in the States, you can't trademark or copyright your voice. It is referred to as an ineffable or intangible asset. What happened to me was that one of my users on my Discord server in my community decided to do it as a test to see how easy it would be. And they did it for the right reasons. They did it because they wanted people to see just how incredibly easy it is to do it. Unfortunately, they left me out of the decision-making loop, and that's why, it came off as little ham-fisted and awkward. But I am taking steps as best I can, as allowed by law. And that is, I don't accept work that is full buyout. I have people express an understanding of my prohibitions on what my voice can and can't be used for. This is going to sound a little bit awkward, but I do use these tools myself. I use ChatGTP. I use 11 Labs. I use Midjourney. To help with my content creation because I'm a solo producer. And if, in my voice coaching, if somebody needs an original script written, it's fantastic for me to go over to OpenAI and use ChatGTP, put in a bunch of conditions and say, I want a 160-word script that when read aloud will come in at 28 seconds and it's about this, that, and the other thing. And it shoots out in literal seconds, and I proof it, and I might make some changes by way of meter or punctuation, but it saves me a lot of time. It does. But I don't just throw it into artificial intelligence and say, work your magic, and then just use it as is. I'm still trying to use it as a tool. But very famously, there's a Japanese saying that to every man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And there are going to be people who use artificial intelligence in ways or for reasons that are less than altruistic. And so we're in this really weird, uncomfortable place right now where, as is so often the case with technology, we love what it does. We think it's cool, and it's powerful and empowering. But what part of the technology are you actually aware of? What part of it listening to you? I mean, I've got this right here, my phone right here. It's listening to me all the time. And I've said that's okay. Why? Because if I say no, it won't do all the cool things that I want it to do. So I have to give it some of my permissions to do things. My big thing about the whole AI issue is one that you were discussing, about generative art AI. Who owns the copyright? Where is the material from? Was there permission to use that material? The big thing about Midjourney is that it scrapes images off of the internet from everywhere, and it's not really good at pulling out the Getty Images logo of the image that it took, and that's a copyrighted image. And so we're running into all these issues of intellectual property and ownership, and I don't know how it's going to shake out. The only thing that I can control is my use of it. Every time I use artificial intelligence in my content creation, I make sure to put a disclaimer that says some aspects of this production have been assisted with artificial intelligence tools. But yeah, we're all in an I don't know place right now. And again, we're all at the bottom of this curve. And this is going to change so rapidly, all our heads are going to spin. So the only thing that we can do right now is make wise choices as as informed a place as we possibly can be, which I admit is pretty confusing right now. But for us creators, take the time if you're selling something that's intrinsic about your person, your voice, your writing, and make a declaration on everything you send. Every single email I have now, my footer now contains the literal paragraph that says everything that I prohibit my material being used in. That's just one bulwark between me and somebody else running off with my voice again. Because now, if I said that and they kept communicating with me and essentially de facto agreed to that, now I at least have legal recourse to say, you can't do that. Let's go to court and talk about this, and settle up because you were not allowed to do what you did with my voice.
Lots to think about. Let's go in a bit of a more fun direction. Let's move a little bit away from AI for a bit.
Can we please? I'm so tired of talking about it.
I think it's fair to ask about.
It's important to talk about. I want people to hear me talk about it. I would just love to talk about bunnies and kittens, though. I mean, I just something else, please. This, eating spaghetti every single night for 3 weeks has just kind of gotten old.
Okay. What's the most outrageous or unreasonable request you ever received from a client for voiceover work?
Oh, there's been a bunch. One of the things that I was willing to do very early on in my voiceover career was I developed a very good muscle for saying no. I've had a lot of requests for odd things. They're more often than not, I politely decline. I did get paid. This is tangential to my voiceover business, but I did some recordings. I did some re-recordings of some, and I'll be careful here, some famous music by probably the most famous British band ever. Where the lyrics were changed in order to support a different message. It was a perfectly ethically acceptable message, but I sang some, did some music work and sang some stuff weirdly for people who loved it, and that was fine. I think probably what I have more of is instances where in negotiation with the client, I discovered that what they were trying to hire me for was something that I was not ethically on board with. I have a story in my book that I wrote, The Quick and Dirty Guide to the Home Voiceover Industry, where I talk about this, and it was a ridiculous amount of money. It was a crazy amount of money. And it was a crazy amount of money at a time where crazy amounts of money would have really helped me out. But once I discovered what the message was and who it was aimed at, I was more than happy to tell them to go pound sand. I would not put my voice to it. And there's a lot of things that I just refuse to put my voice to. But more often than not, I don't mind if I'm being paid to say something that I don't necessarily feel, but I won't let my voice be used for things that harm people or misinform people or support disinformation, those kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I do this quite often because obviously clients will send over script ideas. I tend to kind of avoid, for instance, like political stuff or heavy religious stuff, or also things of a sexual mature nature. Which I know is kind of an interesting one because when you lend your voice to something like that, people wouldn't necessarily know it's your voice, and it's just content is content. But when I look at the way I've presented my brand so far, to then do something like that that's so left field and so far removed from what I present, I feel like it presents a conflict of interest.
It can come across that way. I totally understand. Yeah.
So yeah, I fully appreciate your your perspective on that and your decisions behind that. And I think it's important, yeah, when you're beginning to not just go for anything. It's very tempting to do so.
Oh yeah, and I try to educate people on that all the time. The worst time to make a decision about working on a project is when you feel most desperate.
Yeah.
And beginning voice talent pretty much always feel desperate. They feel desperate for money, they feel desperate for career progress or validation. And yeah, it's hard to say no when you're first starting out because you just want to work. You just want to do something that you can point to and say, I did that, that's my voice. And it can be really challenging to say no.
I could ask you questions all day, but I've got to wind this down. I can't take all of your time. So a couple of final questions, completely unrelated to everything we've been discussing today, but I ask every single one of my guests.
I'm good. Go.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
If you're going to blow your life up, blow it up in such a way that at an absolute minimum, you can stand back and go, wow, would you look at that sucker burn? Look at that. That's beautiful. And that is honest to God advice that I got from my college philosophy professor, who is a dear friend of mine and is on my podcast, which is called Keep Your Hat On. And yeah, that's the reason why I moved out to the West Coast, literally overnight.
So you say it like that as an inspiring message, but what I hear is, hey, if you're going to fuck up, make sure you really fuck up.
Well, yeah, because then at least it's going to be entertaining to look at.
I guess so. Yeah, I suppose you could roast some marshmallows over it. And,
yeah, right, yeah. There. Yeah.
Cheers.
Always look on the bright side of life.
What's the biggest life lesson you've learned so far?
The little tiny things in life are the absolute biggest deal. And don't look away. Don't look away from your life. Observe your life. Be active and be an active participant in your own life. Don't just let it be a movie on the screen. Be a player in your own life.
Let's expand on that a little bit. So do you mean kind of live in the moment and analyze every decision you make and stuff, or is it a bit more than that?
Well, you can see over my shoulder there, I got a Buddha. I've been a practicing Zen Buddhist for about 25 years. And, you know, the term mindfulness is a very shishi topic. It's been beaten to death in the last 10 or so years. But the core wisdom of it, to experience your life from moment to moment, be in that and be aware of it, not analyze it, experience it as it happens. Because I just turned 55 and it felt like I was 22 yesterday.
Right.
As time moves on, as time moves forward, it goes faster and faster and faster. And if you are just a passive observer of your life, you're missing out on all the magic. You're missing out on all those little moments of just watching a hummingbird at a hummingbird feeder, or seeing the smile in a friend's eyes when they walk into view and they see you. Those are the greatest rewards of life. And they're the most beautiful, poignant, powerful moments. And because this dumb thing keeps on making noises and makes you look at it all the time, what are you missing?
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. As we draw things to a close for today's show, do you have any upcoming projects or some final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I'll just run down the places where you can come see me if you want to. Again, I host a 4-person podcast. It's a fully multi-camera produced podcast on YouTube with an audio component called Keep Your Hat On the Narrowband Broadcast Network. That is available on YouTube. Just search Keep Your Hat On NBBN. We constantly fight if you search Keep Your Hat On, Joe Cocker comes up all the time because of his famous song, You Can Leave Your Hat On. But you can find us there. You can also find us over at kyhopodcast.com. That's our webpage. As I said, if you're interested in voiceover, voice work, voiceover technology, you can find me on YouTube at the VO Bootcamp, or you can find me. You can find that also at the VO Bootcamp, or excuse me, I'm going to get my own URL wrong again. At thevobooth.camp. That's the webpage for it. And no, just this is who I am. This is what I do. And I love helping people. So if anybody ever has any questions about home voice work or anything of that nature, you can always get a hold of me directly at Andrew at I'm just going to give you my, because I've got like 37 email addresses. You can always just get a hold of me at Andrew at andrewscottmedia.com.
Awesome. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being on the show.
It's been a treat, Christian. I really appreciate you having me on, and I'm happy to come back on again because I imagine we probably have 4 shows worth of work to talk about.
Oh yeah, I didn't even ask you like a quarter of what I had planned today, but I have had an absolutely amazing time. So thank you.
I'm really pleased. Thank you again. I really appreciate it.
And to all the listeners of the Christian Reeve Podcast, as always, thank you for listening. Be safe, be well, and I'll see you in the next one.